In a city ruled by corruption and fear, a young boy named Ethan is just trying to survive on the streets. But one night, everything changes. While breaking into the mansion of the powerful Whitaker family, Ethan stumbles upon a shocking secret: a woman chained in the basement with a baby in her arms. This discovery pulls him into a dangerous web of lies, conspiracies, and power struggles that he never could have imagined. As Ethan teams up with investigative journalist Grace Cooper and an unexpected ally from within the Whitaker family, they must risk everything to expose the truth. But standing in their way is Nathaniel Whitaker, a man who will stop at nothing to protect his empire, and the ruthless Clarissa, who will go to any length to keep the family's dark secrets hidden. Will Ethan, Grace, and their allies succeed in bringing down one of the most powerful men in the city? Or will they be silenced before the truth comes to light? If you're ready for a story filled with suspense, courage, and heart-stopping moments, stick with us until the end. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and let us know your thoughts as the story unfolds. Now let's dive into the beginning of Ethan's journey. The sun barely peeked over the horizon as Ethan Davis, a wiry 14-year-old boy, stirred from his makeshift bed beneath a bridge. The city never slept, but for a few quiet moments each morning, it seemed to hold its breath. Ethan rubbed his eyes, the cool morning air stinging his exposed skin. Another night on the streets, another battle for survival. His stomach growled, reminding him that hunger had been his companion for too long. He stretched, pulling his jacket, frayed at the edges and a size too large, tight around him. His shoes, worn to near uselessness, barely held together as he stood and surveyed the streets around him. The city had a rhythm, one Ethan had learned to follow. During the day, he kept to the shadows, moving quickly through alleys and behind buildings, avoiding the authorities and gangs that roamed his neighborhood. At night, he sought shelter in the quieter corners, but always with one eye open. As he shuffled toward a nearby dumpster, hoping to scrounge some food left behind from the night before, his mind wandered to memories of his mother, Julie Davis. He pulled the small, tattered photo from his jacket pocket, staring at the faded image of her smiling face. His heart ached in a way he could never quite understand. She'd left him when he was just a boy, leaving only the streets to raise him. He had no idea if she was dead or alive, but the pain of her absence followed him everywhere. Ethan pocketed the photo and pushed aside a soggy cardboard box, revealing a moldy sandwich. He grimaced but took it anyway, nibbling at the edges. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. As he ate, he heard footsteps nearby. His heart sped up. He couldn't afford to be seen. Quickly, he ducked behind a trash bin, peering out to see two older boys from Ray's gang, a local group that controlled most of the kids in the area. Raymond Ray Hartman was a ruthless man who recruited boys like Ethan to do his dirty work, stealing, extorting, or worse. Ethan's stomach clenched, not from hunger, but from fear. He knew these boys. He'd had a run-in with them just last week when Manny, Ray's enforcer, tried to force him into stealing from a passerby. Ethan had refused, and Manny nearly broke his arm. Now they were here, patrolling the streets. "Hey, I think I saw someone," one of the boys said, pointing in Ethan's direction. Panic shot through him like lightning. He ran. His feet pounded against the pavement, his mind racing as fast as his heart. If they caught him, Ray wouldn't just break his arm this time. He'd disappear. That's what Ray did to boys who didn't follow orders. He darted down alleyways, weaving through the maze of the city, desperate to escape. His breath came in ragged gas, the sandwich he'd eaten now a weight in his stomach. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the sounds of the gang faded behind him. Ethan leaned against a brick wall, his legs trembling. "I can't keep doing this," he whispered to himself, his chest tightening. He needed a way out, but the streets were all he knew, and there was no one left to help him. Ethan's desperation grew as the day wore on. He needed food, shelter, something to get him through just one more night. But Ray's boys were everywhere, and the usual spots he hid in were no longer safe. His mind raced, searching for alternatives. That's when he saw it, the Whitaker mansion. The mansion loomed like a monolith at the edge of the city, its towering walls and iron gates gleaming under the pale sun. Ethan had heard stories about the Whitakers. Nathaniel Whitaker, the patriarch, was one of the wealthiest men in the country, though rumors swirled that his wealth had been built on something far darker than business. The mansion had been in the Whitaker family for generations, a fortress surrounded by mystery. Ethan had passed the mansion before, always from a distance. No one went near it, not unless they had a death wish. But today, something was different. He noticed the line of luxury cars leaving through the front gates. The lights inside the mansion were slowly going dark, one by one. It looked deserted. His stomach growled and he eyed the mansion. No one would miss a loaf of bread, or maybe some fruit, right? Ethan glanced around, ensuring Ray's boys hadn't followed him. The coast was clear. Just a little food, he muttered to himself, as if to justify the decision. With a final look around, Ethan made his move. He approached the tall iron gate and noticed a gap near the side. Carefully, he climbed over, his movements quick and quiet. Once on the other side, the mansion loomed even larger, its stone walls cold and intimidating. Ethan moved toward the back of the house, hoping to find a way inside without being seen. His heart raced as he spotted a slightly open window near the kitchen. He pushed it open further, his thin frame allowing him to slip through with ease. The kitchen was massive, with marble countertops and polished wood cabinets. The smell of food hit him immediately. Freshly baked bread, roasted meat, something savory that made his mouth water. For a moment, Ethan felt like he'd stumbled into paradise. He grabbed a loaf of bread and some fruit, stuffing them into his jacket. But just as he was about to leave, he heard it, a soft, muffled sob. Ethan froze. The sound was faint, but unmistakable. It was coming from deeper in the house, down a narrow corridor leading toward the basement. "Get out!" his instinct screamed, but his feet didn't move. Instead, they carried him toward the sound. The basement door was heavy, metal, with a large bolt across the front. Ethan pushed it open, his heart hammering in his chest. As he descended the stone stairs, the sobbing grew louder. At the bottom of the stairs, he found her. Zoe Montgomery, a woman with dark hair matted to her face, sat chained to the wall. In her arms, she cradled an infant, the baby crying softly. Zoe looked up as Ethan approached, her eyes wide with terror and exhaustion. Who are you?" she asked, her voice hoarse. Ethan's mouth went dry. He stared at her, unable to process what he was seeing. Why was she here? Why was she chained? He swallowed hard, the food in his jacket forgotten. I came to steal food," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "But I can help you. I'll get you out of here." Zoe shook her head weakly. "You don't know what you're up against," she warned, her eyes flickering with fear. "If you get caught, they'll kill you." Ethan's heart pounded in his ears. He had always been good at escaping, at running when things got bad. But this was something else. "I'm going to come back for you," he whispered, already turning to leave. "I promise." Ethan didn't run far from the mansion. His mind raced, heart heavy with the weight of what he had seen. Zoe was a prisoner. Why? Who had chained her there? Nathaniel Whitaker had always seemed powerful, untouchable. But this was something darker than he'd ever imagined. He knew he couldn't free Zoe on his own. He needed help. But who would believe him? Ethan's mind flashed to the stories he'd heard about Grace Cooper, a fearless investigative journalist. She'd uncovered corruption in the past, and she wasn't afraid to go after the big players. She had once exposed a high-ranking politician, which had earned her both fame and enemies. He had seen her on TV, always digging into the city's most powerful figures. There was only one problem. She didn't know him. He was just a kid from the streets, a nobody. Still, he had to try. He found Grace's office near the edge of the city's downtown district. The Tribune, the paper she wrote for, was smaller than he'd imagined. He slipped inside, trying to blend in with the shadows as reporters buzzed around the small newsroom. "Can I help you?" a woman asked, eyeing Ethan suspiciously. "I need to see Grace Cooper," he said quickly. "It's about the Whitakers." The woman's eyes narrowed, but she led him to Grace's office anyway. Inside, Ethan found Grace sitting behind a desk, her face buried in notes. She looked up, surprised at first, then curious. "Who are you?" she asked, setting her pen down. "My name's Ethan Davis," he said, his voice shaky. "I know this is going to sound crazy, but there's a woman, a prisoner, inside the Whitaker mansion. I saw her. Grace's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't react the way Ethan expected. She leaned back in her chair, studying him. You saw her? Grace asked slowly. Who? Her name is Zoe Montgomery. She was chained up in the basement. She had a baby with her, Ethan explained, the words spilling out in a rush. I swear, I'm telling the truth. You have to believe me. Grace was silent for a long moment. Finally, she stood and walked around her desk, stopping just in front of Ethan. I do believe you, she said, her voice low. And I think you just uncovered the biggest story of my life. The small newsroom buzzed with activity as Grace Cooper pulled Ethan into a back office. She shut the door behind them, locking out the sounds of reporters tapping on keyboards and phones ringing. The air inside felt heavy with tension, the kind that settled when something huge was about to break. Grace grabbed a file from a cluttered desk and tossed it onto the table in front of Ethan. This is Zoe Montgomery, the woman you saw. She's been missing for almost 3 years. She pointed to a photo attached to the file, showing a smiling young woman with dark eyes and a kind face. Nothing like the woman Ethan had found in chains. Ethan's stomach turned as he looked at the photo. 3 years, he murmured. Why would someone like Nathaniel Whitaker keep her locked up like that? Grace's face hardened. That's what we're going to find out. But make no mistake, Ethan. This is dangerous. The Whitakers have connections everywhere. Cops, politicians, judges. If we make a move without a plan, we're dead. The gravity of her words weighed heavily on him. He was no stranger to danger. Living on the streets had taught him how to survive. But this, taking on the most powerful man in the city, it felt like suicide. Yet the memory of Zoe's desperate eyes haunted him. He had promised to come back for her, and he wasn't about to break that promise. Grace sat down across from him, her eyes intense. We'll need proof, something we can show to the world. Zoe's testimony won't be enough. Nathaniel will bury her story if we don't have hard evidence. Ethan nodded, though doubt gnawed at him. So how do we get it? Before Grace could answer, the door creaked open, and a tall, broad-shouldered figure stepped inside. His scruffy beard and worn leather jacket gave him a rough edge, but his sharp eyes softened when he saw Grace. This is Ryan Blake, Grace said, gesturing toward the man. He's an old friend and a damn good investigator. Ryan gave Ethan a nod, but his expression was unreadable. You're the kid who stumbled onto this mess? He asked, his tone gruff but not unkind. Yeah, Ethan replied, unsure of how much to say. I didn't exactly plan it, Ryan smirked. You never do. That's how you know it's worth it. He turned back to Grace, all business now. So what's the plan? Grace crossed her arms. We'll need to get back inside the mansion. Find something tangible. Documents, records, anything that proves Zoe's imprisonment and Nathaniel's crimes. We expose that, and he can't wriggle his way out. Ryan raised an eyebrow. And how do you propose we sneak past Whitaker's security? That place is crawling with guards, and they're not the friendly kind. Ethan felt his pulse quicken. The idea of going back to the mansion sent a shiver down his spine, but he knew it was necessary. I could get in, he offered. I've done it before. I can do it again. Grace shot him a sharp look. You're 14, Ethan. We're not putting you back in that kind of danger. I don't care, Ethan shot back, his voice firmer than he expected. I promised Zoe I'd help her. I'm not sitting on the sidelines. Grace exchanged a glance with Ryan, who shrugged. The kid's got guts. After a long pause, Grace sighed. Fine, but we do this smart. We'll get in, get what we need, and get out. No heroics. Ethan nodded, though his heart was pounding. He had no idea what they were walking into, but he knew one thing. He wasn't going to let Zoe down. 2 nights later, Ethan found himself crouching behind a hedge on the edge of the Whitaker mansion grounds, the cold wind cutting through his thin jacket. The mansion stood dark and foreboding under the night sky, its towering stone walls casting long shadows across the lawn. It was silent, save for the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant hum of city traffic. Next to him, Ryan peered through a pair of binoculars, scanning the property. Guards at every corner, he muttered. They've upped to security since your little break-in, kid. Ethan swallowed, his nerves jangling like live wires. He had agreed to this, but the sight of those armed guards made his stomach turn. They weren't just rent-a-cops. These were professionals. Dangerous men who wouldn't hesitate to shoot if they caught him. "We stick to the plan," Grace whispered from behind. "Ethan, you get inside through the service entrance. Ryan and I will cover you from out here. Grab whatever documents you can find in Nathaniel's study. We'll have the car ready when you get out." Ethan nodded, steeling himself for what was to come. He hadn't wanted to admit it, but the thought of facing Clarissa, the cold, calculating housekeeper, unnerved him. Something about her had unsettled him during his first visit, and he couldn't shake the feeling that she was more dangerous than she appeared. With a deep breath, Ethan slipped out from behind the hedge, keeping low as he darted across the lawn toward the service entrance. The night seemed to stretch on forever as he moved, each second dragging out painfully as he approached the door. When he reached it, his heart hammered in his chest. He tugged the handle. Locked. Ethan cursed under his breath. He fumbled with the small wire he'd brought with him, slipping it into the keyhole and twisting until he heard a soft click. The door creaked open and he slid inside, his footsteps silent on the tiled floor. The mansion was even more imposing in the dark, its grand hallways stretching out like a maze. Ethan stuck close to the walls, moving carefully toward the study where Nathaniel kept his files. The air was thick with tension, and every creak of the floorboards sent a jolt of fear through him. He reached the study without incident, his hand trembling as he pushed the door open. Inside, the room was just as grand as he remembered, with towering bookshelves and a massive desk dominating the space. The only light came from a small lamp on the desk, casting eerie shadows across the room. Ethan moved quickly, rifling through drawers and cabinets, searching for anything that could help them take down Nathaniel. His heart pounded in his chest as he grabbed a handful of documents and stuffed them into his backpack. Just as he was about to leave, the door behind him creaked open. He spun around, his stomach lurching, as he saw Clarissa standing in the doorway, her cold eyes fixed on him. She didn't look surprised. In fact, she looked like she had been expecting him. "Did you really think you could come in here unnoticed?" she asked, her voice icy. Ethan's heart raced. "You're just making a very big mistake," she interrupted, stepping closer. Her presence was suffocating, and Ethan took a step back, his palms sweating. "Nathaniel told me to watch for you, and now I get to deal with you personally?" Before he could react, Clarissa lunged. She was faster than he expected, stronger too. She grabbed his arm and twisted it behind his back, forcing him to his knees. "You're not getting out of here alive, boy," she hissed in his ear. Ethan's mind raced, panic flooding his senses. He had to get out. He had to. But Clarissa's grip was ironclad, and he could already hear the heavy footsteps of guards approaching. Suddenly, the window shattered as a rock came flying through, hitting Clarissa in the shoulder. She gasped in pain, loosening her grip just enough for Ethan to break free. "Run!" Ryan's voice shouted from outside. Without thinking, Ethan bolted for the window, throwing himself through the broken glass and landing hard on the lawn below. Pain shot through his legs as he scrambled to his feet, but he didn't stop. He ran. Grace and Ryan were already waiting by the car, and the engine roared to life as Ethan dove inside, the tires screeching as they sped away from the mansion. The safe house was a tiny, run-down apartment on the outskirts of the city. Ethan sat on the floor, his head in his hands, his chest tight with frustration and fear. His arm throbbed where Clarissa had grabbed him, but the pain was nothing compared to the weight pressing down on his heart. He had failed. Zoe was still trapped in that house, and now they were more exposed than ever. "Ethan!" Grace's voice was soft as she crouched beside him. "Are you okay?" He didn't look up. I'm not. I should have been faster. I should have." "Stop," Grace said firmly, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You did what you could. It wasn't your fault." Ethan shook his head, his throat tight. "I promised her, Grace. I promised I'd help her." Grace sighed, sitting back on her heels. "This isn't over, Ethan. We'll find another way." Ethan felt anger bubbling up inside him. Anger at himself, at Clarissa, at the entire situation. "You don't get it. I've been running my whole life. From everything. I finally thought I could do something that mattered, and I screwed it up." Ryan, who had been leaning against the wall, finally spoke. "Look, kid, I've seen plenty of good people fail. It doesn't mean they stop trying. You're not done yet. Ethan glared at him, but Ryan didn't back down. You think giving up is going to help Zoe? Ryan asked, crossing his arms. You want to let her rot in that basement? Or do you want to finish what you started? Ethan's anger flared, but deep down, he knew Ryan was right. He couldn't just walk away. He had promised Zoe, and that promise meant everything. I'm not giving up, Ethan muttered, standing up and wiping his face. We're going to get her out. Grace nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. That's more like it. In the days that followed, the tension between the group grew. Ethan's resolve had hardened, but the constant fear of being hunted by the Whitakers hung over them like a dark cloud. They couldn't afford to make another mistake. Grace had spent every waking hour digging deeper into Nathaniel Whitaker's network, uncovering layers of corruption that went higher than any of them had imagined. But no matter how much evidence they gathered, it wasn't enough. They needed something bigger, something undeniable. That's when Ben Whitaker entered the picture. Ethan had been shocked when Grace told him that Nathaniel's son had reached out to her, offering to help. Ben was a man with secrets of his own, and although he had distanced himself from his father's empire, he was still part of the Whitaker legacy, a legacy built on power, money, and blood. I don't trust him, Ethan said bluntly, pacing around the room as Grace prepared to meet Ben. Grace didn't look up from her notes. You don't have to trust him, but we need him. Ben's the only one with access to his father's most guarded information? Ethan stopped pacing, his fists clenched. What if it's a trap? Grace finally looked up, her expression calm but firm. We don't have a choice, Ethan. We need Ben if we're going to take Nathaniel down. Ethan couldn't argue with that, but the idea of trusting someone with the last name Whitaker made his skin crawl. The meeting was tense from the start. Ben Whitaker, tall and composed, stepped into the room with an air of reluctance. His once pristine appearance was now disheveled, and the dark circles under his eyes told a story of a man at war with himself. Let's get this over with, Ben said, his voice laced with bitterness. Ethan kept his distance, arms crossed as he glared at the man who shared the same blood as their enemy. Grace, however, approached him with measured caution. You said you wanted to help, she began, keeping her tone neutral. We're listening. Ben let out a sharp breath, his gaze fixed on the floor. I know what my father is. I've known for years. I tried to break away from him, but... He paused, his jaw tightening. But blood ties are harder to sever than you think. Ethan felt a surge of anger. You expect us to believe you just want to help us now? After all this time? Ben's eyes met Ethan's, and for the first time, there was a flicker of something human in his gaze. No, Ben said quietly. I don't expect you to believe me, but I'm tired of running. And if I don't help you now, then Zoe and everyone else my father has hurt. They'll never be free. Grace studied him carefully. What do you have for us? Ben hesitated before pulling a small flash drive from his pocket. Everything you need. Financial records, names, illegal deals. It's all there. But it won't be enough. My father has a network. People who owe him favors. People who will bury this if we don't make it public in a way that can't be erased. Grace took the flash drive, but her expression remained skeptical. And why now? Why turn on your father after all this time? Ben's face hardened. Because I'm tired of being part of his legacy. I've made mistakes, but I won't let my father's sins define me. Ethan wanted to believe him, but trust didn't come easily, not after everything he'd been through. Still, they needed Ben's help. They couldn't do this alone. Grace nodded slowly. If you're serious about this, we'll need more than just files. We'll need to expose everything. Live. Ben looked up, his eyes widening slightly. You want to broadcast this? Grace's expression was stone-cold serious. It's the only way to make sure it sticks. The night was cold and still, the wind carrying an eerie silence across the city. Ethan, Grace, Ben, and Ryan huddled in the dark alley a few blocks away from the Whitaker mansion, their breath visible in the chilly air. The plan was simple but risky, perhaps the riskiest thing any of them had ever done. Ethan adjusted the strap of his backpack, feeling the weight of it settle against his shoulders. The documents, recordings, and files they had collected so far were hidden inside, waiting to be unleashed to the public. But Nathaniel Whitaker's most incriminating evidence, the one that would topple his empire for good, was still locked inside his private office in the mansion. "You ready?" Grace asked, her voice a low whisper. Ethan nodded, trying to calm the nerves firing off in his chest. He glanced over at Ben Whitaker, who was standing off to the side, his hands shoved into his pockets. Ben looked more like a shadow of the man who had once been part of his father's world, a world Ethan was now determined to destroy. "Ben, are you sure you want to go through with this?" Ethan asked, unable to suppress his doubts. "If we get caught..." Ben met his eyes, a hard edge to his voice. "I'm already in this. I can't turn back now. Besides, I want to see my father fall just as much as you do." Grace glanced at her watch. "It's time. Ryan, you're our eyes and ears. Make sure no one comes near the perimeter while Ethan and Ben are inside." Ryan smirked, flicking the brim of his hat. "Just like old times, huh?" The group shared a quick nod before splitting up. Ryan disappeared into the shadows, heading to his position to keep watch on the mansion's security patrols. Ethan and Ben started their way toward the mansion, sticking close to the fences as they moved through the backyard. The service entrance was their target, the same one Ethan had used during his last visit. This time it felt different, more urgent, more dangerous. He couldn't help but remember the failed rescue when Clarissa had nearly killed him. Now they were back, and this time they weren't leaving empty-handed. "Ryan says the guards are at the front," Grace whispered into Ethan's earpiece. "You've got about 15 minutes before they circle back." "Copy that," Ethan whispered back, his heart racing. Ben was the first to reach the door, pulling it open with a soft creak. Ethan slipped in behind him, careful not to make a sound as they entered the cold, dimly lit hallway. The inside of the mansion felt like a different world, sterile, controlled, with an oppressive air of wealth and power. They crept forward, their footsteps echoing faintly against the marble floor. Ben led the way, guiding Ethan through the maze of hallways that stretched across the mansion like veins. Every corner felt like a trap waiting to spring, every shadow like a set of eyes watching them. As they neared the study, Ben paused, holding up a hand to stop Ethan. His face was tense, the glow from the nearby chandelier casting long shadows on his features. "There's a security panel around the corner. My father installed it after your last visit. We'll have to disable it before we can get inside." Ethan swallowed hard. "How do we do that?" Ben pulled a small device from his jacket, handing it to Ethan. "You've got to clip it onto the panel. It'll short-circuit the cameras for about 60 seconds. That's all we'll need." Ethan took the device, his fingers trembling slightly as he moved toward the panel. He had picked locks, evaded security, and escaped death more times than he could count. But this was different. One wrong move, and they'd be caught. He pressed the device against the panel, hearing the faint hum of the circuits shorting out. The red light on the camera blinked once, then went dark. "Go," Ben whispered. They slipped into the study. The room was massive, with shelves of books, a grand fireplace, and a large mahogany desk. But the real prize was the hidden safe behind one of the bookshelves, something only Ben knew about. He rushed to the far wall, pulling at one of the bookshelves until it swung open to reveal a metal door. The combination lock glinted in the dim light, and Ben quickly began inputting the numbers. Ethan kept watch, glancing nervously toward the hallway. The safe clicked open with a low metallic sound, revealing stacks of files, hard drives, and something that caught Ethan's eye, an old tape recorder. Ben grabbed everything he could, shoving the documents and drives into his bag, while Ethan reached for the recorder. "This is it," Ethan murmured, staring at the tape recorder in his hands. It was old, worn down, but the label on it was clear. "Helen Cooper, final interview." Ethan's chest tightened. Helen, Grace's sister, the one who had disappeared years ago, the one who had been investigating the Whitakers before she vanished. This tape was the missing piece they needed to blow everything wide open. "Ben, I've got it," Ethan said, his voice tense with excitement. But before they could leave, the door to the study swung open, and Clarissa stepped inside. Clarissa's cold eyes locked onto Ethan and Ben, her face twisted into a cruel smile. "I had a feeling I'd find you two here," she said, her voice dripping with malice. Ben stepped forward, shielding Ethan with his body. "Let us go, Clarissa." You don't have to do this. Clarissa's expression didn't change. Oh, but I do. Nathaniel won't be pleased when he finds out you betrayed him, Ben. But at least I'll get the satisfaction of cleaning up your mess. Ethan's heart raced as he clutched the tape recorder in his hand. They couldn't leave without it. Everything depended on what was on that tape. Ben's voice was steady but cold. You don't scare me, Clarissa. Oh, I don't? Clarissa said mockingly, raising a small revolver from beneath her coat. You should be. Time slowed as the gun pointed directly at Ben. Ethan's blood ran cold. Before Clarissa could pull the trigger, the sound of crashing glass filled the room as Ryan appeared at the window, diving through the shattered glass and tackling Clarissa to the ground. The gun skittered across the floor, and Ryan pinned her down, panting from the effort. Go! Ryan shouted, his voice rough. Get out of here! Ben grabbed Ethan by the arm, dragging him toward the door as Ryan held Clarissa back. They didn't have time to think, didn't have time to process what had just happened. All they could do was run. The halls blurred around them as they sprinted through the mansion, their bags heavy with evidence. The front door loomed ahead, and when they burst through it, they found Grace waiting by the car, the engine already running. Get in! Grace shouted. Ethan and Ben dove into the back seat, gasping for air as the car screeched out of the driveway. Ryan was still inside, but there was no time to go back for him. Ethan clutched the tape recorder tightly, his mind racing. We've got it, he breathed, his voice shaking. Grace, we've got the tape. Grace's eyes widened as she glanced back at them. What tape? Ethan held up the recorder, his heart pounding. It's a recording of your sister, Helen. Grace's face went pale, her hands gripping the steering wheel tighter. Helen? Ethan nodded. She interviewed Nathaniel before she disappeared. It's all on here. The car sped through the streets, the city lights blurring around them. Grace didn't say anything else, but the look on her face told Ethan everything he needed to know. This wasn't just about exposing Nathaniel anymore. It was about justice for Helen. They arrived at the small news studio just before dawn. Grace had called in a favor from one of her contacts, a technician who worked at an independent station, willing to help them broadcast the evidence live to the public. The technician, Matt, was waiting for them inside, his face tense with worry. You sure about this, Grace? Once we go live, there's no turning back. Grace set her jaw, her eyes hard. We don't have a choice. We have to do this. They moved quickly, setting up the equipment, testing the broadcast feed. Ethan paced nervously, clutching the tape recorder as Grace and Matt prepared to go live. This was it. This was the moment that would either bring down Nathaniel Whitaker or get them all killed. The red light on the camera blinked on, and Grace stepped in front of the lens, her expression steady and determined. Good evening, she began, her voice calm but full of weight. My name is Grace Cooper, and what you're about to see is evidence of a conspiracy so deep, so dangerous, that it has touched every corner of this city. She gestured to the documents on the table beside her. For years, the Whitaker family has controlled the city through corruption, blackmail, and violence. But tonight, we're going to expose the truth. Ethan watched from the side, his heart in his throat as Grace continued. We have financial records, testimony from witnesses, and a recording, one that proves once and for all that Nathaniel Whitaker is responsible for the disappearance of Helen Cooper. Grace nodded to Matt, who played the tape. Nathaniel's voice filled the studio, cold and calculating as he spoke to Helen. The recording was scratchy, but the words were clear enough. You should never have crossed me, Helen. You knew what would happen. There was a pause, then the sound of a gunshot. The tape cut off, leaving the room in deafening silence. Ethan's stomach turned. Grace's face remained stoic, but her hands trembled slightly as she continued. This is only the beginning. We have more, so much more, and we won't stop until Nathaniel Whitaker is brought to justice. As soon as the broadcast ended, the phones at the studio lit up, ringing off the hook. Reporters, citizens, even law enforcement agencies began calling, demanding answers, demanding justice. But before they could celebrate, the studio door burst open and Clarissa stormed in, flanked by 2 armed guards. You think you can take down Nathaniel? She snarled, her eyes filled with rage. You're all dead. Ethan froze, but Grace didn't back down. She stepped forward, her voice steady. "It's over, Clarissa. You can't hide the truth anymore." Clarissa raised her gun, her hands trembling with fury. But before she could fire, police sirens blared outside the building. The guards hesitated, and Clarissa's face twisted in realization. "Run!" Grace shouted. Ethan grabbed the bags of evidence, and the group ran through the back exit, the sounds of sirens and shouting following them into the night. They had done it. They had exposed Nathaniel. But they weren't safe yet. The days following the broadcast were a whirlwind of chaos and tension. The public uproar was massive. News stations across the country replayed the footage of Nathaniel Whitaker's crimes, and his empire began to crumble. His powerful allies quickly distanced themselves, trying to avoid the fallout. Ethan, Grace, and Ben stayed on the move, knowing that Nathaniel's men were still hunting them. Clarissa hadn't been seen since the night of the broadcast, but they knew she wouldn't give up easily. But their biggest breakthrough came when the FBI finally intervened, launching a full-scale investigation into the Whitaker family. Nathaniel's assets were frozen, and a warrant was issued for his arrest. The group watched from a small hidden safe house as the news broke on live television. Nathaniel Whitaker, the untouchable king of the city, was finally being taken down. Ethan felt a surge of relief and satisfaction as he watched the footage of Nathaniel being led out of his mansion in handcuffs. It was over. The nightmare was finally over. But as the camera zoomed in on Nathaniel's face, Ethan saw something that chilled him to the bone. Nathaniel was smiling, a cold, dangerous smile. "This isn't over," Nathaniel whispered to the cameras. "You think you've won? You have no idea what's coming." Ethan's blood ran cold. Nathaniel wasn't defeated. Not yet. Ethan and the others knew they couldn't stay in the city any longer. Nathaniel's empire was collapsing, but his influence still ran deep. They had to disappear, to lay low until the dust settled. Ryan had managed to escape from the mansion during the broadcast and rejoined them at the safe house. Together, they made plans to leave the country, using Ben's connections to secure new identities and safe passage. On the night of their escape, Ethan stood on the rooftop of the safe house, watching the city below. The lights of the skyscrapers blinked in the distance, and for the first time in a long time, Ethan felt a sense of peace. "You okay?" Grace's voice came from behind him. Ethan turned, offering her a small smile. "Yeah, I think I am." Grace smiled back, though her eyes were heavy with exhaustion. "We did it. We actually did it." Ethan nodded. "We brought him down. But what about you? What happens next?" Grace sighed, leaning against the railing. "I don't know. Maybe I'll keep digging. There's still so much corruption in this city. I think it's time someone cleans it up." Ethan looked out over the city again, his heart lighter than it had been in years. "You're going to do great things, Grace. I know it." Grace chuckled softly. "And what about you? Where will you go?" Ethan thought for a moment. He had spent so much of his life running, surviving day by day. But now he felt like he had a purpose, a new beginning. "Maybe I'll find somewhere quiet," Ethan said, his voice thoughtful. "Start over. Live a life that's my own." Grace nodded, her smile warm. "You deserve that, Ethan. After everything, you deserve peace." They stood in silence for a moment, watching the city as it slowly came to life in the early hours of the morning. "You ready?" Ben's voice broke the quiet, and Ethan turned to see him standing by the door, their bags packed and ready. Ethan nodded. "Yeah, I'm ready." As they made their way to the car, Ethan couldn't help but glance back one last time. The city was still dangerous, still filled with shadows. But for the first time, Ethan felt like those shadows didn't control him anymore. He was free. As Ethan, Grace, and Ben drove into the distance, leaving behind the chaos of the city, the sun slowly began to rise, casting warm light on the horizon. A new chapter was about to begin, not just for them, but for everyone who had fought for justice. And for you, the viewer, this is only one of many stories we're here to tell. If you enjoy this story and want to hear more about courage, hope, and the fight for what's right, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to stay updated. There's always another story to tell, and we'd love for you to be part of it. Subscribe now, because every story can make a difference.